What if I told you that everything we've been taught about the crucifixion, the nails, the thorns, the blood, the agony, was only the surface of something much, much bigger? What if, while the world watched a man hang on a cross, the unseen realm was roaring with battle? Not just a spiritual conflict, but a cosmic invasion. A silent war waged above the skull-shaped hill of Golgotha. And at the center of it, two archangels so terrifying, so powerful, that even Lucifer trembled in their presence. Michael, the war general of heaven, his blade inscribed with the eternal names of God. Uriel, the flame of revelation, whose eyes blaze with divine fire and secrets sealed before the foundation of the world. You've heard the story of Jesus' death before, but you've never heard what was happening behind the veil. Because the crucifixion wasn't just an execution. It wasn't just suffering. It was strategy. It was the King of Glory launching a counterattack from inside enemy territory. And as the skies turned black at noon, as thunder rolled and the ground cracked beneath the cross, heaven wasn't silent because it was confused. Heaven was silent because it was waiting. Waiting for a single command, one whisper from the dying sun, a whisper that would crack open eternity. So let me ask you this. Why did the sky go dark at noon? Why did the veil in the temple rip from top to bottom? And why, on that brutal, blood-stained hill, were two of heaven's greatest angels standing still, eyes locked, swords drawn, and breath held? Because what happened that day wasn't defeat. It was a divine takeover.
Most people picture the crucifixion from the ground. They see a dusty hill, 3 wooden crosses, a crowd yelling insults, soldiers gambling for clothes, and a man bleeding, bruised, dying, hanging between 2 criminals. And yes, that did happen. That's what the eyes could see. But what if I told you that was just the surface? Because that hill, called Golgotha, wasn't just a place of execution. It was a battleground, not of flesh and blood, but of realms unseen, a spiritual collision point between heaven and hell. Now let's pause here for a second. Have you ever walked into a room where you could feel the tension before anyone said a word? Like something was happening just beneath the surface, an argument, a decision, a shift, and your skin could sense it before your brain could explain it? That's what was happening in the skies above Calvary. The Bible tells us that at noon, darkness fell across the land, but this wasn't just a cloud passing overhead. Matthew 27:45 says, "From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over all the land." It wasn't dim. It wasn't overcast. It was black. And it stayed that way for 3 full hours. Why? Because something was happening in the invisible world. Something heaven had anticipated for millennia. Something hell never fully understood. The skies weren't just dark. They were under siege. Lucifer, the fallen one, the dragon of old, was watching. The same enemy who tempted Eve in the garden, who schemed against every prophet, was now staring at the seed of the woman he was told would one day crush his head. And to him, this looked like victory. The Son of God, helpless, bleeding, nailed to wood. But in the spirit realm, that wasn't the full picture. There were others watching too. Archangels, guardians, witnesses to eternity's turning point. Michael, the war angel. Uriel, the flame of wisdom. They weren't singing. They weren't fighting. They were waiting. And in that pause, in that stillness, the universe held its breath because even the angels didn't know exactly what would happen next. And that's where we go next. into the heart of the two most powerful angels heaven ever sent to earth. One to guard, one to reveal. Both standing at the edge of two realms as the King of Glory bled between them. Let's meet them.
They stood there, silent, still, and waiting. Not because they were uncertain, but because they had been appointed. Michael and Uriel, two of the most powerful beings in the heavenly order, and on that day, the darkest in human history, they weren't just observing the crucifixion, they were guarding something eternal. And let's start with Michael. You've probably heard his name before. Michael is heaven's general, the commander of angelic armies, the one who battled Lucifer in the book of Revelation, who contended with the prince of Persia in Daniel's vision, and who will one day sound the trumpet of final judgment. But at the cross, Michael wasn't charging. He wasn't swinging his sword. He was holding the line. Now picture this. A being of unimaginable height, clothed not in shining gold, but in armor that pulsed with living flame. A sword in his hand, etched with the names of God, glowing with holy fire. His wings weren't feathers, but layers of starlight and galaxies folded in reverence. He wasn't there to fight a battle in the way we understand it. He was there to enforce a moment that had been planned before the foundation of the world. And then there was Uriel. Now, Uriel's name might not be as familiar. You won't find him named in most Bibles, but ancient Hebrew texts, like the book of Enoch and 2nd Esdras, refer to him as the angel of wisdom, the flame of God, the keeper of secrets. While Michael embodies might, Uriel represents mystery. His presence is not thunderous, but radiant, a furnace of divine light. His eyes are white-hot with revelation. His role? To carry the hidden things of God and release them at the appointed time. In that moment, Uriel wasn't just witnessing the crucifixion, he was preparing to unseal the greatest mystery ever written, the redemption of mankind through the blood of a sinless lamb. You see, these two weren't sent to comfort. They weren't sent to fight. They were sent to stand guard over something too sacred for the human eye to see. It's kind of like watching over a bridge as it's being built between two worlds. And here's something worth thinking about. Sometimes in life, your greatest battle isn't one you fight with your fists. It's one you stand through. Michael stood firm, Uriel burned silently, and neither made a move until the Word himself gave the signal. That's the kind of obedience that shifts eternity. And that's exactly what happened next, because as the world mocked and the sky turned black, Jesus, the Lamb, the King, the Word, didn't resist. He waited. He restrained his power. And that is when hell started to tremble. Let's talk about why.
Have you ever seen someone who had every right to fight back and chose not to? Maybe it was a parent holding back their anger when wronged, or a teacher being insulted and staying calm, or a friend taking the high road when they could have humiliated someone who hurt them. It's powerful, isn't it? Now imagine that, but on a cosmic scale. Jesus, hanging on that cross, could have ended it all. He could have called for 12 legions of angels. That's over 70,000 celestial warriors armed with heavenly fire. He could have turned Golgotha into a smoking crater with just a breath. He could have stepped off that cross untouched and made every knee bow right then and there. But he didn't. And that silence was what terrified hell. Because Satan understands something most people don't. Power that's restrained is far more terrifying than power that's unleashed. The enemy thrives on chaos, on reaction, on violence. But when Jesus refused to react, when he stayed nailed to the cross, silent, bleeding, still, that wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was authority. And hell didn't know what to do with it. The demons started to back away. The air above the hill began to shift. Something wasn't going according to Lucifer's plan. He thought he'd won. But the calm on Jesus' face, the silence from his mouth, the lack of resistance, it didn't look like defeat. It looked like strategy. And that's when Michael tightened his grip on his sword, not because he was about to charge, but because he felt it. Uriel's eyes burned hotter. He wasn't just watching. He was reading the spiritual atmosphere like scripture unfolding in real time. And they both knew this wasn't surrender. This was the setup. A divine chess move that hell never saw coming. You see, Jesus wasn't losing his life. He was laying it down on purpose at the exact hour in the exact way for a reason written before the stars were born. And that brings us to one of the most overlooked yet most powerful moments on that hill. A command. Not shouted, not screamed, but whispered from a dying body and heard in the highest realms of heaven. Let's step into that moment when Jesus issued an invisible order and eternity shook in silence.
There was no trumpet, no thunder, no angel descending in a blaze of fire, just a cry, a human voice, dry, cracked, weak, carrying a line that pierced through dimensions. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now most of us hear that and feel sadness. It sounds like abandonment, like despair. But what if it was something more? What if it was a signal? You see, in the physical world, people standing nearby thought he was calling out in weakness, but in the spiritual world, something entirely different was happening. Because that cry wasn't just sorrow, it was activation. Heaven heard it. Michael heard it. Uriel felt it. It was like thunder across eternity, except it didn't move through the air. It moved through spirit. And in that moment, a command was issued, not to crowds, not to soldiers, not to Rome, but to angels. 2 words, whispered through blood and breath. Guard what is mine. That might not sound earth-shattering, but when it comes from the mouth of the eternal Son, who holds all authority in heaven and earth, it changes everything. Because at that moment, Jesus was hanging between 2 worlds, his body in the physical, his soul descending into the realm of the dead, but his authority still intact, still active. And this wasn't just about survival. This was about a transfer. You see, on the cross, Jesus wasn't just suffering, he was carrying every sin, every failure, every curse of humanity. And that transfer had to happen perfectly. No confusion, no interference, no loophole. So Michael snapped into formation, not to fight men, not to defend Israel, but to stand guard over a covenant being sealed in blood. Picture it, like a legal transaction, the most sacred document ever written, being signed right there, in pain, in blood, in silence.
And Michael? He was heaven's security detail. Uriel didn't move either, but inside him, the light of revelation pulsed brighter. He wasn't there to strike. He was there to make sure that what was happening, this mystery of redemption, would not be missed, not by heaven, not by the future. You know, sometimes in life, the most powerful moves are made in silence. Not when we raise our voice, but when we stand our ground. Not when we fight with our fists, but when we protect something sacred, even if no one else sees it. That's what Michael and Uriel did. And that's what Jesus was doing too. Because he knew, to win this war, he had to go lower than death, deeper than shame, darker than sin itself, and rise from within it. And that brings us to a part most believers never talk about. What happened after Jesus died? Because the war didn't end at the cross. It just changed locations. And next, we go beneath the surface, into the spiritual underworld. Let's follow the king, not into a tomb, but into Sheol, where the dead waited, and the gates had never been challenged until now.
Let's imagine something for a moment. You're sitting in a courtroom. There's a judge on the bench, lawyers on both sides, documents on the table. But the most important part? The signature. Because no matter how dramatic the trial, nothing is official until the contract is signed. That's what was happening at the cross. We often think of Jesus' death as emotional, tragic, even heroic, and it was, but it was also legal. It was a transaction, an exchange. The book of Hebrews says it clearly, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Hebrews 9:22. In ancient Jewish law, every covenant, every binding agreement between God and man had to be sealed with blood. It wasn't symbolic, it was the stamp of heaven's approval. And Jesus wasn't just the signer, he was the signature. Now here's where Michael comes in. At that exact moment, as Jesus hung there, blood spilling, breath fading, Michael wasn't swinging a sword. He was standing between realms, enforcing the terms. No demon could interfere. No spirit of confusion could slip in. No whisper of accusation could undo what was being written in blood. Michael was heaven's legal witness. He wasn't allowed to interfere physically, but in the spiritual realm, he was immovable. Picture him like a divine firewall, blocking every illegal access point, guarding the transfer of human sin onto the sinless Son of God. And what was being transferred? Every sin you and I ever committed, every lie, every betrayal, every hidden shame, all of it placed on Jesus like a weight no man could carry. But he carried it anyway. Why? Because the contract had been written before time began. A covenant that stretched all the way back to Genesis when God told the serpent, "The seed of the woman will crush your head." And here it was, being fulfilled in full view of heaven, hell, and earth. It's easy to see the cross and think it was only about suffering, but in reality, it was a divine courtroom, and Jesus was both the defendant and the judge. Michael held the space. Uriel watched the scroll of prophecy unfold, and in that silence, something sacred was secured. Here's a thought. Sometimes we go through things that feel brutal, painful, and confusing, but behind the scenes, something eternal is being settled. So don't mistake silence for absence. Sometimes heaven is very busy, especially when it looks like nothing's happening. Now, speaking of heaven working quietly, there was someone else at the cross, burning, but still, waiting to reveal something that would ripple through time. Let's talk about Uriel and how one blast of divine light changed history forever.
If Michael was the sword at the cross, Uriel was the fire. but not fire that consumes. This was fire that reveals. You see, while Michael stood guard over the legal transfer of sin, Uriel stood guard over something else, just as important, but far less visible: revelation. The Bible tells us that there are secrets God has locked away since the beginning of time, truths so deep even the angels long to understand them. And Uriel? Uriel was the keeper of those secrets. Now picture this. As Jesus' blood touched the earth, something unseen began to move in the spirit. A wave, a burst of divine light, radiating from the cross, not just across space, but through time itself. This wasn't lightning. This wasn't fire from heaven. It was what we might call spiritual shockwaves, rolling through generations, activating eyes that hadn't even been born yet. Think about Paul on the road to Damascus. One minute he was a persecutor, the next blinded by light and hearing the voice of the risen Christ. What if the first spark of that encounter didn't begin on that road, but at that hill, in that moment when Uriel released light into the future? What if the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wrote not just from memory, but from revelation already planted in their spirit generations before? What if your own faith today, your ability to recognize truth, to feel conviction, to see with spiritual eyes, is part of that same ripple? Because Uriel wasn't just standing in silence. He was broadcasting, releasing insight, clarity, understanding, sent ahead like seeds of light into the hearts of future believers. The Bible says in 1 Peter 1:12, even angels long to look into these things, and Uriel was the one showing them. Here's a simple truth we sometimes forget. Not all change happens in the moment. Some of the most powerful revelations begin in silence and take years, even centuries, to unfold. That's what Uriel was doing at the cross. He wasn't just witnessing history, he was embedding it into the future. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more supernatural, something physical happened, something we could actually see. The veil in the temple, the thick, holy curtains separating man from God, ripped in two. But that wasn't just fabric tearing. That was the sound of a cosmic gate opening. Let's go there next.
It happened in an instant. The ground shook, the rocks split, and deep inside the temple, in the very heart of Jerusalem, something unimaginable occurred. The veil tore. Not from bottom to top, like a man might tear it, but from top to bottom, as if heaven itself reached down and said, "No more." Now, for those who might not know, that veil wasn't just a curtain. It was thick, some say as wide as a man's hand, and it separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. Behind it was the presence of God, so holy that only one man, a high priest, could enter once a year, and only with a blood sacrifice. It wasn't just cloth, it was a barrier, a divine boundary between sinful man and perfect God. But when Jesus died, that veil, reinforced by generations of angelic guards watched over with fear and awe, was torn in half, and for the first time since Eden, the way back to God was open. Think about that. For thousands of years, people could only come so close. They had to bring sacrifices, wait for priests, stay on the outside, hoping their sins were covered. But now the Lamb had become the bridge, and heaven made it very clear the separation was over. And here's something few people ever consider. That veil, it wasn't just a physical thing. It had spiritual enforcement.
Ancient Hebrew tradition speaks of angelic sentries, guardians of sacred space positioned around the Holy of Holies, because no one could enter that place without being appointed by God. So when the veil tore, Michael and Uriel didn't rise in alarm. They stood down, not in defeat, but in reverence, because their assignment had been fulfilled. Michael sheathed his sword. Uriel released one final burst of holy light, and the message was loud and clear. Access had been granted. The wall was gone. The presence of God was no longer locked away. Now, anyone who believes, anyone at all, can draw near. And that brings us to one of the most breathtaking parts of this story. Because while the world above went still, something below was starting to shake. Jesus had breathed his last, but he wasn't finished yet. Next, we follow him beneath the earth, into Sheol, where ancient prisoners waited, the dead held their breath, and gates forged in rebellion were about to be challenged for the very first time.
The moment Jesus breathed his last, the world above went still. But beneath the earth, everything started to tremble. Because while Rome thought the execution was finished and hell thought it had won the war, Jesus wasn't lying in silence, he was on the move. Not in metaphor, not in poetry, in spirit, literally. He descended into Sheol, the ancient Hebrew realm of the dead. Now let's unpack that for a second. Sheol wasn't the hell Hollywood likes to show you, flames, pitchforks, and red devils. It was something older, deeper, more complex. In Jewish thought, Sheol was the underworld, a waiting place. It held two sides, one for the wicked, tormented in separation from God, and one for the righteous, Abraham's bosom, a place of peace and promise, but not yet full redemption. And between the two, a great gulf that no man could cross. But Jesus wasn't just a man anymore. He was the Word-made Spirit, scarred by the cross, still carrying the weight of sin, but now moving with the authority of heaven. He entered Sheol not as a victim, but as a king, and he came uninvited. Lucifer had no idea it was coming. The fallen watchers, those ancient beings chained since the flood, felt something shift. The gates groaned. The underworld itself reacted, because someone foreign had entered their domain, without asking, without permission, without fear. Have you ever walked into a room and suddenly everything changes just because of who you are? That's what happened in Sheol. Except this wasn't just about presence. It was about power. Jesus didn't come to negotiate. He didn't come to request souls. He came to take back what was stolen. And behind him, Michael walked, glowing, silent, sword ready, but unused. Uriel followed, burning like the morning sun, carrying mysteries still sealed from the beginning of time. They weren't there to protect him. They were there to witness what no angel had ever seen before: God walking through the gates of death with full authority. The Psalms had hinted at it long ago. Psalm 24, verse 7, "Lift up your heads, O you gates, be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." Now those gates weren't metaphorical. They were real, spiritual thresholds forged in rebellion. They held the dead in silence for centuries. But now they were groaning, not because metal moved, but because legal chains were breaking. And what Jesus did next would forever change the fate of souls. Because he didn't just come to visit the dead, He came to set them free. And that, my friends, is exactly where we're going next. A moment so powerful, so unthinkable, it turned Sheol into a jailbreak. Let's step into the moment Jesus took back the keys.
Sheol had never seen light. It was a place of shadows, of silence, of separation. For generations, souls had waited there, righteous and unrighteous alike, held in their compartments, watching the centuries go by. Prophets, kings, mothers, shepherds, the nameless and the known, all of them waiting for something that had been promised but never fully understood. And then, without warning, it happened. Light entered the underworld. Not a torch, not a flicker, not a dream. A presence, a being, the King of Glory, walking through gates no man had ever touched. And suddenly, the silence of the dead was shattered. Demons fled into corners. The ancient rebels, those chained since the flood, shook in fear. And the waiting souls, the ones who had trusted in a coming redemption, they stood up because they knew what they were seeing. Abraham, Moses, David, Isaiah, Ruth, Deborah. They weren't confused, they weren't unsure. They recognized the Lamb. And then Uriel moved, carrying what the prophets longed to see, what angels had waited to understand. He opened a scroll of light, etched with truths that had been sealed since the dawn of time. And as it unrolled in the Spirit, something began to happen. Revelation flooded the realm. Suddenly, it all made sense. The sacrifices, the symbols, the serpent lifted in the wilderness, the blood on the doorposts in Egypt, the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. They saw it. They saw him, the fulfillment. And that moment, it wasn't quiet. It was a roar in the Spirit, like prison doors slamming open, like chains hitting the floor. This wasn't an escape. It wasn't a rescue mission. It was a jailbreak. Legal, final, irreversible. Jesus wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't knocking on gates. He was taking back the keys. And Michael? Michael stood as heaven's witness. His sword didn't strike because there was nothing left to fight. This wasn't a battle. It was a declaration. The debt is paid, the dead are free. And in the deepest part of Sheol, Jesus reached out his hand, and the keys appeared. Not forged by men, not held by devils, etched with eternity. The key of death, the key of Hades, the key of every prison that had ever existed in the Spirit. And then Jesus turned to Michael and said 3 words that echoed through eternity. Time to rise. And that's where everything shifted, because the resurrection, it didn't begin in the tomb. It began right here, in the belly of the earth, in the place of waiting, where light met darkness, and darkness lost. And what Jesus did next, he didn't do for himself. He did it for every soul that had ever been trapped, and every one of us who ever would be. Now let's go there. Let's return to the surface. Because 3 days later, that stone didn't just roll away for a man. It opened for a king, leaving captives in his train.
The stone rolled away. The tomb was empty. And for the first time in human history, death had no claim. But here's the part most people miss. Resurrection didn't begin at the tomb. It began in Sheol. It began the moment Jesus took the keys and said, "Time to rise." Because what happened in the Spirit reshaped eternity. He didn't sneak out of the grave. He walked out as a king, not just alive, victorious, not just restored, enthroned. When Jesus said, "It is finished," he wasn't talking about the pain. He wasn't saying, "I'm done." He was declaring that the greatest assignment ever given, the divine rescue plan written before the stars were born, had just been completed. The debt was paid. The curse was broken. The veil was torn. And the gates of death were no longer locked. And at that precise moment, all of heaven responded. Michael, who had held his sword since the garden, raised it high, not in battle, but in honor. Uriel, who had carried the hidden mysteries of God, sealed the scroll, now fulfilled. And eternity? It shifted. The cross wasn't just a symbol of suffering anymore. It became a throne, a gate, a bridge between the seen and the unseen. And what does that mean for you? It means you were never meant to fight alone. Even in your darkest moment, when your body is tired, your mind is spinning, and your prayers feel like silence, heaven is moving. You may feel like nothing's happening, but angels are still on assignment. The blood is still speaking, and the King is still commanding from places we can't yet see. So when life gets quiet, when the night gets long, remember this. Sometimes your greatest victory won't come from shouting, but from enduring just like he did. Because in that stillness, heaven hears. And now you know. The crucifixion wasn't just death. It was strategy, a silent takeover, a moment so sacred that the universe had to stop and take notice. Michael knew it, Uriel saw it, and now you've seen it too. So let me ask you, which moment gripped you the most? Was it the war above Golgotha? The light in the underworld? The whisper that moved heaven? Drop it in the comments. Like this video if it opened your eyes.